Well, good afternoon. It's really good to see so many of you here for the Open Source Schools presentation at BETT. Is everybody enjoying the show? Yeah? Anybody bought anything yet? There's only one hand. I'm wondering whether this year it's a different sort of BETT show. It seems strange for a start not having the government agencies over there in the National Hall, and the loss of Vector, the loss of those other agencies who are really leading ICT across the whole education sector here in the UK has made a difference to us. And I think now we've moved into a new era where we're going to have to take more responsibility for these things ourselves. And of course, that's always been the case with open source software. So open source, I think, very much fits into that particular picture, that particular way of doing things. What else? The lack of money, the change in the funding is a difference as well. And I suspect many of us working in the UK sector are very conscious that there isn't as much money to go around now. So why is that? I'll tell you a little about me before I start on the presentation properly. My day job is in teacher training at Roehampton University. I'm working with students who want to become primary school teachers, both undergraduates and postgraduates. Over and beyond that, I'm involved with organisations like NACE, with Computing at Schools, the BCS, and Open Source Schools, which was a project set up by Vector 3 years ago now, which has carried on past the end of our Vector funding as a community of practice, supporting one another in using open source software across UK schools. So why is there no money? Because there's none left. Now, this was the letter which David Laws, the incoming Chief Secretary to the Treasury, found from his predecessor there waiting for him on day one in the new job. I'm afraid there is no money. Kind regards and good luck. And there are many of us, I suspect, who are finding ourselves not quite in that boat of there being no money, but certainly being in a point where we have to be a lot more careful about justifying the money that we spend on IT resources, of ensuring, as indeed we must do, that we get the best value we possibly can. I think open source provides one solution to that particular challenge of trying to do more, or trying to do at least as much with less resources. So the brave new world in which we find ourselves, given that there is no money, how did our incoming Secretary of State deal with this? Well, three of his first actions was to tell Vector that their funding was going to cease from April of this year, to take first a quarter and then half off the Harnessing Technology Grant, which was the money schools were relying on for their infrastructure, and then to put a stop to the BSF programme, which, okay, was about school building, but also included a considerable component of IT expenditure, IT capital expenditure. So those three decisions suggest that the new government perhaps feels that at least the money that's been spent on ICT under previous administrations isn't necessarily going to be something which continues now. So what do we do? Is this the end of the world as we know it, or is this an opportunity to do things differently? Well, I see it as something of the latter. Everybody familiar with the ARM chip? Anybody? Wonderful success story of British computing. British computing has this wonderful history of doing really clever, innovative, exciting things. Think back to Bletchley Park and Turing and the Colossus machine and cracking the Enigma codes. Think to the early days, the 1980s, with educational computing in the UK, with the BBC Micros and the Sinclair Spectrums, and those of us who were writing computer programs up there in our bedrooms, and the start of the UK computer games industry from that time, of doing so much with really very, very little. The ARM chip is one of those success stories. Hermann Hauser, this is the same team who brought us the BBC Micro, the same team who brought us those Acorn RISC machines in school. Where did they go next? What did they do after that? The ARM chip, which is a tiny little microprocessor, which does things very, very differently. It's a reduced instruction set microprocessor, and the secret of their success. These chips are in so many of our phones, so many of our embedded devices. It's an unsung story, but the secret of their success, as Hermann Hauser said, he gave his team two key advantages: no money and no people. And so they had to do things differently. And even back in the days of World War I and early submarine detection, Ernest Rutherford saying, we've got no money. We have to do things differently. We have to look at a more creative way of doing things than just throwing money at these particular problems. You're familiar with open source, I hope, and have an idea of what that means. It's not simply about one way of writing software. You can apply the same principles across the whole field, really, or across in other fields. So I'm going to ask a gentleman called George Osborne to explain to us a little about open source and ways in which it might apply outside of the software world. Here we go.
I think you will increasingly get a form of open source politics. Open source software is the idea that there is this software program on the internet and anyone can write the code for it, and it can be used in all sorts of different applications. Open source politics is a similar idea. Here are problems out in our society. Instead of relying on politicians, government ministers, Whitehall civil servants to have a monopoly of wisdom on how to solve that problem, you would be engaged through the internet, through the technology available these days, in getting the whole of the public, or as many of the public are interested in, solving a particular problem. You could start at a very local level. You might have a particular community problem, crime in a particular street, or a problem with a particular school, and engage the community in finding a solution to that problem. But you can also envisage it at a national level. For example, we've just had debates and votes in the House of Commons on complicated issues around human embryology and abortion and so on. Well, those are issues that many people in the public understand just as well as any politician. Why not engage them in a decision like that?
An idea which is very much in tune with notions of big society, notions of community involvement, notions of people working together to solve problems. I hope those of you who are school teachers in the room, quick show of hands, who's here actually teaches real life children? It's nice to have a few of us. That's brilliant. Okay, thank you very much for that. Just another quick show of hands. Who here is a UK delegate? Somebody who's working in a UK school? Okay, somebody who's working internationally? It's a few more. Okay, right, thank you very much. Other aspects of this picture. Back in March, sorry Leon, stand in one place. So back in March 2009, Ofsted produced a report on the importance of ICT. It was quite a critical report. It made a number of observations about ICT in school not being a challenging, engaging subject. Section B of the report talked about the responsibilities on school governors to get best value from their IT expenditure. And there are a couple of comments that they make that those principles of best value include comparing performance with others to see where improvements could be made. So look at some of the stuff which they say there. Open source operating systems software, a reliable, cost-effective solution, enabling the few schools that choose this route to achieve excellent value for money. Few schools used open source software for establishing virtual learning environment. We know what one they're talking about there, I think. Enabling them to obtain several years' worth of development with no licensing costs. This is not an open source pressure group. These are not open source advocates that are making these claims. This is the government's education inspectorate, Ofsted, who are looking at this from a hard, rigorous point of view and saying, actually, you can get much better value. You can get very good value by going the open source route. They also say the principles of best value, the responsibility onto school governors, is to challenge why and how a service is being provided. Small numbers of schools that have deliberately chosen to provide a mixture of operating systems, students met a greater variety of software, better equipped to cope with rapidly changing technologies. Surely that's a good thing, and I hope you can see why Ofsted are saying that's something which at least a school needs to make a decision about, rather than the default being to buy the usual proprietary operating systems and packages, to at least consider whether there are alternative ways of doing this. This is old data now. I suspect the picture now is even more rosy than the one painted here. This was Bechter back in 2005, looking at the total cost of ownership for IT in schools across a whole different collection of measures, looking at the hardware costs, the software costs, comparing open source schools, that were schools that were using even just a small part of open source software, with those that were using entirely proprietary systems. And look at those savings over on those right-hand columns. For open source in a primary school, a 44% saving in terms of IT expenditure on the schools that Bechter surveyed. In a secondary school, 24% saving. They're massive figures when you think about how much a school might be spending on its IT budget. But look, it's not just the software line of this. Yes, you'd expect to see savings there. But look also that these schools are making savings in terms of their hardware expenditure, in terms of their support, their formal support costs were much less in the open source schools than they were in those which were using entirely proprietary software. I'd love to see the new figures. You know, how has this picture changed? 2005, there were hardly any schools using web-based services like Moodle, like ELB, like WordPress. I suspect once you bring them into the mix too, then the picture is even more positive than the one which Bechtle presented back in 2005. So why are there those savings? How come is it so much cheaper to use open source, or how can you get better value using open source? Well, there are a number of reasons for that. The most obvious, of course, is that you do not have to pay any license fees. Open source software, there enshrined at the heart of the free software definition, is that this is software that you do not have to pay to run, to install, to use. You're free to run the program. More importantly, I would suggest, not only is it free for you as a school, it's also free for all of your pupils to use this software. So it's not simply best value for you, but also best value for your pupils. And if their parents' financial circumstances is not as they once might have been, then they might be particularly appreciative of having a disk full of software which they're using in school that they can use at home for free without having to pay for licenses for that stuff. And free to redistribute software as well. You have a sustainability argument that open source, because it doesn't require you to keep pace with the latest hardware specification, upgrading your machines, upgrading your software every time a new release is available. It allows you to have a more sustainable approach to your ICT in school. It's a greener approach to computing, particularly if you're not having to throw machines away at the end of 3 years when they're still perfectly useful, perfectly usable machines. Other aspects, deep at the heart of the free software movement, the new GNU Linux operating system, is this idea of having small pieces of software that do what they do very, very well and fit together to make a cohesive whole. So you don't need the whole thing to be open source. You can pick and choose, and the bits fit together just as well as Lego blocks did. You've also got software which is written by the people who generally are responsible for supporting it. The people who are supporting the use of open source software and making sure it works in their institutions, in their settings, are the ones who are also writing the code for it and providing support for it. So there you've got this ambition that it be stable, reliable software that doesn't need a heavy commitment to maintenance. Think about Apache web servers, think about Bind DNS servers, the infrastructure on which the whole of the internet depends, and how much we rely on those and how reliable those bits and bobs really are. One of the linking to that, you have this notion that the technical staff who are involved in that support are actually really empowered by this process. No longer do they have to go around fixing problems, but they can take responsibility for developing the software, for adapting it to fit in with that school's, that institution's own particular context. Their job becomes a much more interesting, rewarding, fulfilling one, that they don't have to spend time deploying fixes and keeping things ticking over, that they can actually use their time to start developing software, to start developing resources, moving from the position of your network guy in school as a technician to him, her becoming a technologist and really leading the way the technology is being deployed. Why is that? Because, again, as part of that free software definition, you have the freedom to improve the program. Because you've got access to the source code, you can adapt it to make it fit with exactly what you want it to do in your school. And that's a cost saving. You don't have to go and buy software to do what you want. You can change the software that you've got, and that's a great plus. The software you get is fit for purpose, typically developed by people who are in not dissimilar situations. They're interested in using it. The way open source software projects get started is somebody has an itch, somebody has a problem that they want to solve for themselves. So they're determined to get the software right because they want it to do what they need it to do. And then other people come in and join in and make these projects better, and the whole community coalesces around this stuff. So you have software that comes to embody teachers, educators' understanding of learning, technologists' understanding of software, rather than serving the marketing department's view of a particular sales proposition. And of course the support comes not through commercial contracts, but through being part of the community. And that community includes the developers, it includes technical people, it includes others who are using the software. And the availability of that support is second to none, I would suggest. You know, you post the question there on Christmas Day, somebody will respond on Christmas Day. I hope none of you were posting tech support questions on Christmas Day. Other costs which you don't always consider when buying software: what happens if something, if you become dissatisfied, you've moved over to one system, you're stuck with that. With open source software, because you're controlling the data, because you're controlling the programs, you don't have that same risk of vendor lock-in. We hear stories of learning platform providers, software service providers whose business model changes, or they go bankrupt, they stop trading. What happens to your pupils' work? With an open source deployment, it's there on your servers. You've got control of that data. You're not exposed to that financial and reputational risk. It's worth mentioning here, Paul's going to say more about all of these things later, the opportunity for a school to do so much more with its web-based applications, setting up its own Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP web server. Once you've made it over that hurdle, it's not that bad a hurdle. And all of these web-based tools, Moodle, Alg, Drupal, WordPress, for your learning environment, for your social networking, for your blogging, for all of these things, become something which you can provide to the students in your school using a web server which you've got yourself. The scripts to do this, all downloadable off the internet. You've got resource booking, you've got library management, technology to do all of that available for free. The essential message, then, is one about being able to do more with less. By not spending money on these software licenses, by using open source software, you have the freedom to do things which otherwise it would be impossible or prohibitively expensive to do. You also have control of exactly what you're doing and control of all that data yourself.